Hello, my friends. This is Rick the Fat Man. Welcome to your seat at the table and one of my special installments. This is Cardolan, the successor state that could have been or could have thrived. I tried to find some peppy opening music or theme work or something like that, and most of the stuff I find has either got some kind of copyright attached to it or it just doesn't quite work. So, apologize for the lip being dry. So, we'll look at this Cardolan. We know that in the Third Age, around 800 and such, the last true king of Arnor, for some reason, lost his marbles and decided to break up his country into three successor states, or three smaller kingdoms, each at that point to be led by one of his sons. And the continuing downfall of Arnor was accelerated at this point. Cardolan was the third or the second and possibly the second largest section of Arnor. And I think I'm of the opinion, we're going to go through some points. The geography and having direct access to the sea meant that of the three successor states, economically speaking, Cardolan had probably the best chance for long-term survival and success had there not been conflict with Angmar and the never-ceasing petty bickering between this nation and its neighboring two sisters, especially after Rador falls and becomes a client state of Angmar at the end of the day. If you look at the geography, Eredor is pinned in between the River Baradin, or the Brandywine, and the Great East Road to the north, and it extends fairly deeply into Eredor to the south, although they suggest it's bordered by the Guatho, so it's in between two large rivers. So you have two river boundaries, and you have the ocean or bay to the southwest of. So it's the side of access to the Weather Hills or the Weather Top, and along the northernmost areas of Cardolan are directly accessible from land. The rest of it has some water barriers to one degree or another to help protect it. It's also astride the Greenway, or the north-south road that connects Arnor to Gondor and other human nations to the southeast, which will allow it to gain trade access from both a land route and from the sea. Tharbad itself was also known to have been established long before Arnor came into existence, so there's some already heavily established history there. That the opportunities for Cardolan to at least thrive and maintain its independence were there. The leadership, though, not so much. Now, we're looking at boards of greenish right here. So one of the problems, especially beginning in the early days of this new kingdom, is its constant bickering with Rador and Arthedain over control of the Weather Hills, and most significantly Weathertop. Weathertop, or Almasol, of course, as we know, is the seat place for the chief planter of Arnor, and this is a very hotly desired uh, location, both because of who controls Weathertop controls chief communications and the ability to foresee things through the spheres of Almond Soul. And then there's the status symbol, because it is one of the key cultural and hereditary or heritage sites of Arnor, and whoever is in charge of Almond Soul tends to, control a lot more than what they, politically speaking. So there's this need or this desire to control it, to keep at least keep themselves embedded in some aspects of Almond Soul's operations on a day-to-day basis. This sees numerous small petty wars between them and the other two states, which further weakens them physically speaking. Diminishes their pure-blooded Dunedain bloodlines to to quite a bit of a degree. It's mentioned repeatedly. They also control the ancient Edain burial sites of the Barrow Downs, and while they don't directly claim or control Bree. Bree's also a crossroad, so having access to Bree gives them some advantages that Radur lacks and Arthedain lacks, because Arthedain is a bit more isolated now than it was before. Before, when it was Arnor still had access to Tharbad, had access to the old Mondir and the two river, access to the ocean, which gives them sea power ability, or at least ability to be supplied and resupplied and to conduct trade via Gondor. Right. So when we're looking at that second point, the constant contesting of Weathertop and the Weather Hills, and what this means is generation after generation of the best and brightest of the country march off to war on a regular basis, and some of them don't come back. Now, if you look at this particular map, you'll notice that there are actually a significant number of settlements in Cardolan. Unlike Radur, Radur only had a handful. There's only one that qualified as a seat, which was where the Camath Bryn, and it would have been the capital of Radur, and they had villages and thorps and things like this, but nothing of significant size. Cardolan, on the other hand, does, and some of these predate Arnor. They go back, way back to the glory days of Numr, when this whole region, and then of course the early Second Age, when this whole region was heavily forested. There was a lot of conflicts in this between the elves and Sauron and so on and so forth. In the past, when Nuremberg gets settled and established, they heavily forest this region, and it has a detrimental effect on the ecology of Cardolan in particular. There are large areas that when you remove the forest, the ground's just not really suitable for agriculture. It becomes much more barren and less productive than it would have been if it was left covered in trees. So, but that still goes on to some degree. You still have the Rastvorn, the peninsula to the west, there where there's a lot of wood and still in existence, and there's still some woodlands. The agriculture of the area is mixed. A lot of grazing and raising of sheep and cattle, that sort of thing would go on. There are, along the river basins, though, there would be plenty of river bottom land for farming, and very decent farming, so you support the population as long as there's a population there to run the farms, right? So when we look at back to the geography issues, my third point is the claim on the ancient Barrow Downs. This is another cultural, political thing. As a barrier, the Downs are an effective, or about the best they can do terrain-wise to help fortify their northern approaches to Cardolan proper. So it makes sense to want to control those areas, just like it makes sense to want to control the Weather Hills because of the same reason. The cultural claim is that ancient Edain, the predecessors of the Numbrians and the Dunedain, were buried here and lived here back in the First Age, and many returned in the Second Age. This is also when we look at returning once the fall of Numr, and the return of the Dunedain out of Numr, especially Isildur and his 4 ships that settled in the north of pure-blooded Dunedain faithful, to find a fairly significant population of Dunedain and lesser Dunedain existing prior to them coming here. They didn't just show up. Isildur didn't just show up with a few thousand people and declare that Arnor, as vast as it is, as being a country, because that's just like a modern-day Yahoo who controls a local community claiming an entire state or an entire country because in name only. No, you have to have physical footprints, political footprints. You have to have settlers. You have to have people who will bow down to your claim and your lordship for that to be accurate. So the truth was that there was already a large population of Dunedains, higher Dunedain and lesser Dunedain, along with Dunlandings, the Dunmen who come from all points to the southeast, and a handful of Northmen already here. So having in the tens of thousands, having Dunedain of various pedigree already pre-existing when you get here gives Isildur a larger base of operations to work with than what he would have had And they did some significant works prior to, between the settling of Arnor and the battles of the Last Alliance. They did some significant works, got some significant communities, Fornost and Anumis settled and constructed, or mostly constructed, fortifications constructed. Prior to the fortifications, they were doing, I want to say social, statuary and monuments and things like this. And they did quite a bit of it. Then they marched off to war, and a big chunk of Arnor's best and brightest didn't march back, and it was a shot to the heart of an already thinly populated place to begin with. So the same applied here to Cardolan. So once Cardolan becomes an independent country, it has quite a few Numerian bloodlines in it, houses of pure blood and lesser Dunedain populating the region, thriving farms and manor states and towns and things of this nature. It's the constant conflict that grinds them down. The fact that Dunedain are a long-blooded race, they live longer than the average middlemen or low men of the region. Their tendency not to want to integrate themselves with those lesser bloodlines because they're trying to preserve their cultural distinction means that they don't repopulate as fast. That's the downside. They don't have the muscle or the sheer volume of numbers like Gondor does at the start to make up for any great losses in conflict. So when we see that, and prior to the Arnor falling apart and the conflicts with Angmar in the beginning, and then later conflicts amongst themselves and conflicts with Arnor and its agents, just slowly whittles away at what could have been a successful country state. So we move on to my next point. By Third Age 1300, there's no direct blood descendants of Isidore remaining in Cardolan. So at this point, the battles and attrition and time have whittled away the royal bloodline and its connection to Arnor proper. So some cousins of cousins, distant cousins, or another Dunedain, high Dunedain bloodline takes over as the king and kingship, but they lose that high faithful connection, that highly desired royal, uber royal line, and it dwindles and becomes mixed and becomes non-existent. So we get towards the end, a little later than between 1300 and 1400, things are not going well with Angmar, and Radur's succeeded and fallen and more or less become a client state of Angmar, opening up Angmar, Witch Queen having more access, his supply lines have more access to Arthedain proper and reaching into Cardolan itself. At this point, Cardolan is forced to ally itself with Arthedain, but it does so at great cost. One of those great costs, which is not spoken of very much, but I've seen evidence of it, and that leads me to believe that there may be some truth to this, that because Cardolan's borders are pushing closer to, their population centers are closer to this northern border area, they're going to carry the weight more. And when Angmar makes his sudden assault in the 1409, the forces crush in on the Cardolan's royal military forces that are in the north, cutting them off and laying siege to them in the Barrow Downs. And it's for whatever reason, Arthedain is slow to come to their rescue. By the time they mount a significant push against Angmar in 1409, Angmar's already destroyed the cream of Cardolan's forces, including its king and the king, the last prince. So in Third Age 1409, Angmar attacks in force, defeats Cardolan, the last prince and son perish. What it means by defeating Cardolan is it defeats Cardolan and not physically in territory. Angmar doesn't sweep down into Cardolan and Tharbad, lay siege to Tharbad or in other communities, does not physically claim the province. Now what it did was it eliminated its bloodline its kingship bloodline. Second time, this time there's no replacement. There won't be time for a replacement. The things are coming to a head. The lion's share of its military martial capability. This will be the best and the brightest, the young and the strong, and the mostly male of the population who responded to the king's call. So now we're going to see a repeat of Arnor after those second alliance on a smaller scale in Cardolan. There's not going to be sons and husbands coming back from this conflict, and the communities are going to dwindle even more. They're going to become even more desperate. There's also a talk that there was growing famine in this 100-year stretch. In the next couple hundred years, Cardolan still exists, but in name only. It's constantly trying to save itself. There's a lot of bickering and political maneuvering of the Dunedain houses that are left, but there's no significant effort to aid Arthedain against Angmar. So Arthedain's pretty much on its own at this point, and Cardolan's just a dying husk of a country. It still potentially had a chance if forces come from Gondor had come to Gondor sooner, if the existing bloodlines, existing Dunedain houses were to get their act together and reconstitute themselves. They may not have been able to field a significant force of any size to affect the conflict between Angmar and Arthedain at this point, but they could have held in there as a country. And I don't think Angmar would have pestered with them as long as they kept south of the Barrel Downs and out of their issue with Arthedain, because as a rule, his attacks, the Witch King's attacks in the 1409 or so, pretty much did what they needed to do. So here comes a couple hundred years later, Third Age, 1636, the Great Plague. This is a coup de grace for the population, for the lion's share of the Dunedain. It is said, it is suggested over time that the plague affected men quite heavily, but it really affected the higher bloodlines of the Dunedain. The Numerian descent took a hit even harder than the lesser men did, and I believe that is somewhat of design, because I do believe Sauron had some hand in the creation of, or enhancing through dark art, sorcery, what have you, of the existing plague to make it that much more virulent as it moved west. We never hear the numbers of people affected in the east and the south, the Cardolan and the Easterlings. We don't know how devastating it was. We know it affected them, but it sounds to me that it grew much, much worse as it crossed the Anduin and into Gondor and then further north. So the fact is that in 1636, after 1636, Cardolan as an entity ceases to exist. There are still settlements. Tharbad still has settlements, still has population. It's no longer thriving, but it's still struggling. It's still there. So what we see is my next point, after the Great Plague and the War of the Ring. The years between the Great Plague and the War of the Ring is a constant, slow diminishing of settlements. The high men die off. The Dunedain die off or move away. It could be that a handful of them move to the north, either to the Angle and Radur, or to the hills of Evedon, to join with the Arthedain Dunedain that are there in order to support Aragorn's family bloodline claim and to bide their time for the day that perhaps that they'll resurge. I think the lion's share of the surviving Dunedain, especially the High Dunedain, move south to Gondor, because they just have little left here to work with. The Dunlandings also seem to move and migrate back towards some of their more natural lands near Isengard, because we don't have any evidence of any significant Dunlanding presence in this region of Eredor, either in those years between the Great Plague and the War of the Ring, some 1,000-odd years. There is an exception or two. There's implications that there was a minor kingdom called Saracen or Saradan or Sarsaradin, mostly a northern hillman mix kind of like your Highlanders, and they settled in along the southern Brandywine near the Vast Horn. That's that wooded area to the far left that you can see peeking off the map, and along the river basin. Uh, Gandalf supposedly had some hand in trying to create this to make sure that these at least became a neutral group, a neutral region of men, as opposed to falling into the habits of dealing with the evils of Sauron and things like this, the later nations. But it too peters out at some point, well before the War of the Ring. All we have is the handful of stories that are held back by the elves, and a few northern houses that had retreated to Gondor, who maintain some historical facts and fictions, as well as stories that are muttered occasionally around the tables of the Shire, things like that. So, in a nutshell, looking at what could have been, the coulda, shoulda, woulda. Cardolan and its king is descended from Isildur's bloodline. His branch dies off, and they're not clear exactly how and why and when, but it's believed it's in the conflicts, the petty wars, or it's implied, or in my opinion, he did not die in combat against Angmar himself. That was a later king who was from another bloodline of Dunedain, who had no connection, or perhaps very peripheral connection, to Isildur and his bloodline claims on Arnor and Gondor. So once that weakens the royal claim, the constant if they'd have withdrawn to keeping control over the Barrow Downs and the regions south of the east-west road, then perhaps Cardolan would have survived, outlived the conflict between Angmar and Arthedain. Because I don't believe at this point Angmar really has any designs. It's which king is not there to conquer Arnor and all those lands and settle them and populate them for the greater glory of Sauron. That's not what he's there for. He's there to wear out the Dunedain, specifically the High Dunedain and the faithful, and destroy Arnor as a political force, as a physical force, to weaken the West in their responses to things that Mordor does. If you think about this from a grander perspective, and I'll bring this closer pretty shortly. Had Arnor remained intact and Angmar not settled, how much more could Gondor have accomplished to the east and around Mordor, specifically against the incursions of the Wayne Riders and the Easterlings and the constant waves of invaders that's supposedly or implied, instigated by Sauron and his agents, had they had an intact ally in the north. Had Arnor been able to field moderate-sized concentrations of troops to go to Gondor's aid on critical moments instead of the Rohirrim or others, how much different the politics would have been, how much more powerful Gondor would be, how much harder it would have been for Sauron to accomplish what he does in the years leading up to the War of the Ring, and the War of the Ring itself. So, had Cardolan existed as a human state, as a human country, as a Dunedain settled and controlled northern country, still would be able to gain and add support to Gondor, militarily, economically, psychologically, philosophically. So this was the imperatives. This was the key reasons that the Witch King, in my opinion, was sent forth to the north. He created this kingdom with the sole intention of dispersing the Arnor footprint, to diminish the Anorian Dunedain to the point that they're ineffective and or worse. So to see Cardolan fall in that way, in bits and pieces and fits and starts. Like I said in my previous video about Rador was doomed from the start. It had absolutely almost no High Dunedain at all, any faithful at all. There were very few, and they were already having dark or selfish bent mindsets, and the lesser Dunedain were in modest numbers, in the hundreds, not in the thousands. I believe Cardolan would have had lesser Dunedain in the tens of thousands at the beginning, and High Dunedain in the thousands, where in Arthedain you'll see the highest concentration of Dunedain, both high men and lesser men. and fewer problematic men. Cardolan has its share of Dunlandings, Dunmen, and Northmen, but Redour is dominated by Hillmen and Dunlandings and former mercenary Northmen. So it's a completely diverse group of people who are hardly able to communicate because of the rugged nature of Redour and its environment. Well, Cardolan doesn't have that. Cardolan is well established. It has the Great Bridge crossing the Guafo for Tharbad, and then Tharbad itself was a seaport. It also has numerous inland roads and maintained them. So the Great North-South Greenway, for example, is a key interstate or transportation and supply. So they're central to controlling and maintaining the Arthedain as a country itself. Arthedain doesn't believe it until it's too late that they needed Cardolan. It's suggested at the very end that the king of Arthedain attempted to re-annex Cardolan, but he simply just didn't have the forces. It was just too little, too late. And the Angmars, the Witch King's forces, were pressing much harder in the west and the north against Arthedain because there's nothing left in the south for them to worry about. And there you have it. I believe that Cardolan at one point. Let's touch on one last point. After the War of the Ring, Cardolan was become once again a key transportation hub. As a larger country, aside from the river valleys, like I said, it's not really great farmland except down through the two large river valleys, but there's lots of grazing land, lots of potential for agriculture on the hoof. We know that from trade perspective, having Tharbad as in the past acts as a good seaport, and you need a decent sized bridge of some sort, or at least a permanent set of ferries working, because the river's quite broad and fast, especially in the spring and fall when the floods come. So you're going to want to rebuild this. King Essler is going to probably rebuild Tharbad in some aspect, whether it's on the same ruins of Tharbad or at some other point. It's up to, that's hard to be said, but he's going to reopen that greenway, and more trade and travel is going to be crossing that road again, and he's going to make use of it. So yes, Cardolan as an entity will come back, probably not as Cardolan. It'll be part of Arnor, a southern province. Who knows what it would be named. It's also going to be a buffer state for the Shire to help keep the settlers from Manny settlers, giving them places to settle that doesn't press directly on the Shire at the point, and opening access to Arthedain. Because now, of course, with the departure of the elves in London, that also opens up areas for additional ports and access for the heartland of Arthedain. But I think Cardolan in the direct path from Gondor would make perfectly good sense to do so. Well, that's my 10 cents on the subject, my friends. I hope that you found this stuff as interesting as I do, and at some point, put your 2 cents in, make your own videos, commentary on it, right? Nothing else gives you gives you a little bit of stuff to listen to. You're cruising down the road. Until next time, this is Rick. This is your seat at the table.